think most of the fabrics you're going to want for 3D printing are not the easiest to work with for sewing or vice versa. So not the best match made in heaven, but you work with what you have. So for 3D printing, you really want to pick something that has like holes, like a mesh. I'll hold something up here. This just looks, it's also called tulle, and it has like holes in it.
Hey everybody, welcome back to our episode of Meet the Makers. Today I am joined by a very special lady. She sews, she 3D prints, and she manipulates AI to spit out some of the coolest things that I have ever seen. Today I am joined by Julianne. So excited to have you here today. Really a different take from everybody else that I've talked to. I think we're going to have a really fun conversation.
Yeah, I'm super excited to be here.
Awesome. So before we dive into what you work on and all the cool projects that you have on your side, I have to ask, I'm not sure if you've had the chance to see it because it's just started to emerge out on my timeline before we jumped on this call, but the Met Gala was last night and I started to see the looks come out. Have you had a chance to see any of the different looks from the Met Gala last night?
Yeah, I love watching Met Gala, like first Monday in May. It's super fun. Some of my favorite looks. Oh gosh, and now I gotta remember them. Jenny from Blackpink, I thought she had a really cute, like old Chanel look. And then Rihanna's, she was very, very late, but her big coat was really pretty. And I just love seeing her pregnancy outfit.
Yeah, she always, everywhere she goes, she looks amazing. I'm like totally on the bandwagon with this one, but when I saw Jenna Ortega's dress last night, I was just like, oh my God, in love. All of the looks, so many great ones last night. But yeah, as soon as I was laying up last night and it was about midnight and they started pouring, I was like, oh my God, I can't go to bed now. I have to see what everybody was wearing. But yeah, really cool stuff last night. But for people who maybe haven't seen your content yet, you yourself make some amazing pieces. Can you maybe start out and just talk a little bit about like how you got into sewing and fashion in general?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start with my 3D printing journey because that actually starts a little bit earlier and go into my sewing journey. I started 3D printing a bit in high school. I was on my school's robotics team, and so we did 3D printing for that. And I actually did like a tiny little bit of fashion stuff back then too. I made a dress where I 3D printed out like beads that looked like a pyramid, and then used like Tinkercad to create a hole in the pyramid and sewed them onto a dress. And then later, during COVID in 2020, I actually taught myself how to sew because I was sitting at home and I was just bored. And I was like, this is something I've always been interested in, but never really learned how to do. And that's where I really got into fashion. I think I was pretty into fashion at a young age, but that's where I actually started like implementing designs and these things that I had in my head. I was never a great illustrator, and so I never felt like I could draw fashion designs, but then actually being able to produce them was really great. So I learned how to I learned how to sew. And then since then, I've actually taken some classes on the side at FIT to learn like more pattern design. And right now I'm taking a handbag design class.
Interesting. It's interesting to hear. Now, as somebody who has experience with sewing machines, has experience with 3D printers, everybody talks about how like the 3D printer maintenance is so crazy. Do you find one versus the other to be more difficult to maintain?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think traditional 3D printers are harder, especially I'm really excited about the current era of 3D printers where we're seeing some that are like a lot better just out of the box.
Yeah.
Some of the older ones, some of the ones I bought mine like 2020-ish, and they're definitely more maintenance than a sewing machine. Like a sewing machine, you just thread it and it works, at least for the like mechanical ones. I don't actually have a computerized sewing machine. I don't know if those are a bit harder, but yeah, sewing machines are built to just go forever, especially if you get one of the really old ones. If your grandma has a sewing machine, go ask her for hers because they'll be super good.
It's funny you say that. My mom, I think she still has it actually, is my great grandma's sewing machine. And like you said, that thing, it went and went. I think if you pulled it out of the box today, it would probably still work perfectly. Yeah, it's crazy to see that. Now, at least for me, I think a lot of people look at 3D printing and they think that's like a difficult learning curve. I look at sewing. I have a sewing machine myself and I don't use it very often. To me, I find that to be like a little more of a intimidating machine to approach. I guess as a beginner, do you have any advice for maybe a machine to start on? I know you talked about like a mechanical versus a computerized, but I guess any advice for beginners who are looking to get into sewing in general?
Yeah, so I have a Singer Heavy Duty, which I really like. It's really great because you can sew a lot of different materials. It doesn't have a lot of stitches, but to be honest, I think at least when I was a new sewer, I like looked at all these machines and I was like, oh my gosh, I need to buy the one with 300 stitches. I got to use them all. But if you're going to go into quilting, that's really great. But if you want to make clothing or just accessories or something more basic, like you don't actually need all of the like bells and whistles. It's really just about having something that's like really good at a straight stitch, a zigzag stitch, having like a buttonhole, and maybe a couple other things. There's a lot of like super great resources on YouTube too that have like great recommendations for sewing.
On that note, one of the things like I've heard a little bit about when you're getting into it, and I guess I do have some firsthand experience with this, is the material maybe that you're starting to sew with matters a lot of like what you start with as a beginner. I know for me, one of my first projects I did, I had started with a knit that was like very stretchy, and I had a really difficult time with that. Any recommendations there as maybe somebody's going into the fabric store for the first time, what they should look for on a beginner project?
Yeah, I was the worst at this because I'd go into the fabric store and I'd be like, I want something super shiny and sparkly and bedazzled, embroidered. You definitely want to avoid that. Highly recommend just like a basic kind of cotton. You can get a pattern, but you want something that's kind of medium weight. You don't want to go too thin or too heavy. I actually, on my TikTok, posted about an organza dress I tried to make. And organza is one of the worst fabrics to try to sew with. It's super slippery. It's like hard to hem because it frays so much.
Okay.
And so I would definitely recommend sticking to something you would think of as like the material of a button-up shirt. Okay. And it's good to avoid knits as well. Knits they're going to stretch while you're sewing if you don't know how to sew yet. And that can create a really like wonky puckered garment.
Yeah, I should have brought it out for example purposes. It's a little scary looking, but yeah, it was like puckered, and I was trying to make a pillow, but it took on a very frightening shape. I don't think anybody would have recognized it as a pillow, but yeah, that definitely makes sense. Now, one of the things you talked about was maybe organza is not like a great fabric to start with. I know on the 3D printing side, I believe that typically when you 3D print on fabric, you were printing on like a mush material, or I think you can use organza as well. Do you, like for somebody who's maybe looking to do that, is that a difficult material to work with on the sewing side as well?
Yeah, so I think most of the fabrics you're going to want for 3D printing are not the easiest to work with for sewing, or vice versa. So not the best match made in heaven, but you work with what you have. So for 3D printing, you really want to pick something that has like holes, like a mesh. I'll hold something up here. This just looks, it's also called tulle, and it has like holes in it. You can also do like a stretch mesh, which is like sometimes sporty material. I have the mesh top that I guess I wear to work out in sometimes. And then there's organza, organza is like these, it's sometimes sparkly, sometimes more matte, but it's very voluminous fabric. If you've ever seen like selfie dresses, a lot of those are made out of organza. I'm trying to think about what else. Sometimes wedding dresses can be made out of organza. You can also use like chiffons, anything that's like a more sheer material. Anytime you go to something that's thicker and doesn't have that holes, the filament won't actually extrude into it. The one exception is with TPU filament, you can get a bit better adhesion if you use something that doesn't have holes, but it's a bit hit or miss. Like you have to play around with it. And this still extends to knits as well. So if you have a knit that is like more see-through, has more holes in it, those can also work pretty well for 3D printing on.
Interesting. Now, one of the things you mentioned in there was like TPU, it gives you a little bit of a better adhesion. Maybe for people who aren't as like familiar with the different filament types, could you possibly talk us through, I guess, like an application where you might want to use TPU versus a more standard PLA when you're sewing for like fashion purposes?
Yeah, so PLA is pretty hard, and you definitely want to use small pieces if you're going to print on fabric with PLA. Otherwise, the fabric won't be super easy to manipulate. It'll be like a big chunk of plastic.
Yeah.
So I think one of the like common examples is you see like spikes on them or like scales. And those, because there's so many holes between all those pieces, it's still like a movable piece of fabric. TPU is good if you want to make a bigger design that doesn't have like separation in the design. That way, because TPU is a flexible printing material, the fabric will still have drape. There's also, I recently heard about a filament called like OBC, I think. Oh. I haven't tried it yet. I need to buy some, but it's supposed to also be a flexible print that is less difficult to work with than TPU. because TPU can be really hard to print sometimes. I don't know if you have any experience with it, but it's given me some headaches.
Yeah, I have very limited experience. I've only run TPU a couple times, and for that reason, it's like only a special occasion where I really want something flexible that I'll break it out. But I've actually never heard of that other filament that you mentioned. That's interesting. I'll have to look into that. And I'm not sure if you've tried this or heard other people talk about it, but I've heard some people start to talk about the flexible PLA as well. I'm not sure if it has like similar properties in terms of like how easy it is to use compared to standard PLA, or if it kind of tend to act more like TPU. But that's another one I've been interested to try out too.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance. I gotta add that to the list. Too about TPU is TPU comes in like different, like you can get 95A shore hardness, which is a bit easier to print, versus I sometimes use like 82A, which is even like looser. And I've seen some people use 70 and 60, which is, I don't think I could print 60A. I don't think it would work, but maybe, I don't know. I tried hard enough, but yeah.
Now, when you're like laying these prints down onto fabric, I've seen two different methods of people just like printing directly onto the fabric, or do you tend to do where you like sandwich it in between the like a layer of filament and like a layer of fabric and then a layer of filament? Do you find one of those works better for you?
Yeah, so I definitely prefer like you do the first layer of the print and then you pause the print and then you lay down a piece of fabric and then you continue the print. I find this just so I've actually been able to wash some of my garments, and when I do that, the pieces stay on. And if I do not do this, sometimes the pieces do not stay on. So if you want longevity, I definitely recommend going with like the pause print method. But if it's like something for more cosplay, you can get away with just like putting down the fabric if it's a very like mesh piece of fabric. Again, the more holy the fabric. Oh, that sounds funny. The bigger the holes in the fabric, the easier time you will have.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. The more sacred the fabric is, the better it will hold on to the filament. No, it's actually really interesting. You mentioned washing the garment. I know this probably sounds crazy, but that piece didn't ever even crossed my mind is something that you would do with your clothes. God forbid you wash them. That's actually really interesting. I guess you could run something on a cold cycle. Have you ever had a problem with like running it through the wash and like having the filament like degrade or like melt or anything like that, aside from just like pulling off of the fabric?
I washed it on like warm and I put it in a garment bag. So I think between those two things, it stayed pretty safe. And it was a mesh, so it was like not, I don't know if I would want to wash, like usually you don't wash organza the typical way anyway, so I don't know if I would just throw organza in the washing machine. It's something I'd like to actually run more experiments on, where I just like print on a bunch of different fabrics with a bunch of different filaments and throw it in the wash. One thing I have thought about is from like a sustainability perspective. I don't know if we talk a lot about like microplastics and those come off of clothes. And I think I do worry about, if I'm throwing a PLA print in the wash, are there microplastics coming off of that? And even if I don't visibly notice the product looking worse, that's something I have thought about, is like, I don't want to be contributing more to clothing is the second worst industry after like electronics in terms of waste. And so that is something I've thought about, and really am hopeful that there will be more sustainable filaments as well that come out that will work well for my use case.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see. Like, I know a lot of people talk about PLA specifically being a bioplastic, and I've seen some videos of people like trying to compost it and things like that. And I don't know enough about it to be like any sort of expert, but it does seem like even PLA, which people talk about like having these great properties, has a difficult time breaking down. So I agree. I think it would be interesting to see an intersection of something that is maybe a little more sustainable, but also isn't going to break down if you put it in the wash. It would be interesting to see that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, PLA is supposed to break down, and it does, but it usually takes like commercial kinds of composting, and it's not something that's just going to biodegrade on its own. So, something we, as a community, hopefully we can aspire towards more exciting filaments in that way.
Absolutely. Now, staying on that note, actually, like one of the things that had initially got me interested in sewing for a little bit was I'm like a huge fan. I love thrifting, and I love giving like old pieces like a new life. For you in sewing, do you find that's, I guess, a way to maybe repurpose older pieces that might have come out of fashion, or is that something that like you work on when you're making different projects?
Yeah, so I've never actually done, I think usually the term for that is like upcycling.
Yeah.
There's a ton of cool creators that do a lot of upcycling. I've never actually done a like 3D printed upcycle project, because usually you can't just do the print on an already existing piece of clothing,
Right,
unless you like do a lot of funky stuff to try to get it on the build plate with only one piece. Because if you think about a shirt, like you don't want both layers of the shirt to be printed on because then you can't put it on. So I haven't actually done an upcycling project in that way. I've done a couple just like that predate my 3D printing stuff. It's definitely something I've thought about and would like to find a better way of doing it. I saw a wedding veil at the thrift shop once and I almost bought it, but it was like so beautiful and I was like, someone probably will want this for their wedding. I don't want to make it, like I should leave it for them. But yeah, maybe that I'll have to add that to my to-do list of projects. So at some point do some sort of upcycling thing.
Yeah, it's funny you say that actually about when it's an actual like shirt and not just a flat piece of fabric, having a problem with that. I did one time I tried printing on a shirt and I hadn't thought that through. I had purchased the shirt to print on and then realized as I was laying it down on my bed, like, oh, I have to figure out something to do with the other 3/4 of the shirt that aren't being printed on. So that was it was a bit of a fiasco there. But yeah, it's so many like different things that come into play when you're trying to make these pieces. Or I don't see a lot of people like doing 3D printed fashion. I know that there's a couple people on TikTok who I'm familiar with who do it, but it's not a lot of people. Do you feel like this kind of gives you the opportunity to like push like boundaries of different things that you wouldn't traditionally be able to do with other, just like a standard sewing machine or things like that?
Yeah, I think really the thing that I find exciting about 3D printing with fashion is how like you basically can just put whatever you want on the fabric and you can create like a 3D visual on the fabric, which most like traditional textiles, you're only doing something like you're doing a 2D pattern that's like screen printed, or you're doing like, or if you are doing something 3D, it's super expensive and time consuming. If you think of the beautiful like hand beading and like 3D florals that you often see on like wedding dresses or like couture gowns, like with 3D printing, we can create a 3D flower that is printed on fabric, and it's none of the like crazy man hours it takes for those Met Gala dresses. And it's not exactly, I mean, I think there's something to be said for that like handmade quality that's just absolutely beautiful, and so much respect for that. But I also think with 3D printing, there's so much opportunity to be able to do that on a scale where like one person, like by myself, I can make something that is as intricate as what they do. And that's hopefully someday I will be able to make a full gown that's like super, like a ton of 3D printed elements. That project still intimidates me a little bit, but I'm excited to get there.
I'm excited to see when you get there. I was like following along in the different pieces that you've done, and you just do a lot of unique things I don't see other people doing. In the theme of dresses, you had one dress, it's actually your profile image, but you had it where it lit up. What kind of made you go down the road of deciding to do that project? Because it's just really pretty and really unique.
Yeah, so I guess for more context, I talked a bit about doing robotics in high school, and then I ended up getting my undergrad in computer science. So when I took a break from 3D printing, a lot of the other stuff I was exploring was code. And I knew I wanted to find a way to, obviously you can use code some with 3D printing, whether you're like coding in OpenSCAD to create a digital design, or you're coding your actual printer. Not that I do that very much. I try to stay away from G code when I can. But I think I wanted to do something with code, and I decided to use like an Arduino, which is what is in that dress. It's there's a bunch of different kinds of Arduinos. They're the computer chips. And I connected it to a bunch of RGB lights, and then I could code the dress into any configuration I wanted. Because I don't know, I think fast fashion is such a thing that has been going on in the past 20 years, and it's like sad that we have so much waste. And so I thought about, if you make a garment that can change over time and can be a different dress every time you wear it, even though it's like physically the same dress, that saves the planet. And it's like super cool too. Every time I wear that dress out, I get so many compliments. Sometimes it's low. I don't want to be this much the center of attention, but it's super great. And I get to change the color. I've tried to code the lights to look like water. I've tried to code the lights to look like fire, just done fun colors, rainbows, that especially if we're coming up on June. For Pride, I'll probably try to do some sort of like rainbow dress. So it's exciting. And it's cool because it's like, now that I've built it, I can just code for it and I don't have to like rebuild it every single time.
I love what you said about having this piece that can transform over time. And I hadn't thought about it in that sense, but almost even just like for the seasons, it's cool that maybe you could go to a winter event and have it be like a little more frosty looking. And like you said, Pride's coming up, you could do something for that. So yeah, that's a really cool aspect to it. I didn't think about that component, but it's really interesting that you say that.
Yeah. And I think that garment I don't wash. I haven't quite figured out how that could go in the laundry. But I think if we could make more things like that like change. I've played around a bit with like UV filament where in the sunlight it changes color. I think when I think about like in 20, 30 years, what I would love to see fashion look like, I'd love to see more garments that are like interactive and like change over time or change based on inputs.
Yeah, I feel like there's so many possibilities of the way that technology, especially as it's evolving so quickly right now, how it could probably evolve into fashion. I know one of the things that you talk about is using AI to prototype different ideas for fashion designs. Can you talk a little bit about how you got into doing that and just like what your experiences have been with iterating on like different looks and styles and prompts that you're using in those AI tools?
Yeah, so I found out first about DALL-E like late last year. And then I found Midjourney, which is my personal favorite for image generation. I think I actually haven't played around with DALL-E recently, so it could have caught up or been different, but I think Midjourney just responds really well to giving it types of art styles. So I mainly use AI kind of for inspiration, like when I want to generate ideas. As I said earlier, like I've never been a great illustrator, and I think that like really held me back when I was younger. And I think having AI really means like I can type a description of the kind of garment I want to create, and then to have it like create a picture of something. It's not usually exactly what I imagined in my head, unfortunately, but it gets in the right direction. And then to be able to have that image and tweak it over time. One of the great things about Midjourney is you can prompt it with an image. So I can prompt it with an image it's already generated and then add like additional context for how I want to tweak it. This has just been like super great for me. It's also super cool because you can use it to generate patterns. So I've actually used it to generate a like Voronoi pattern. And then I tiled that and put it on I converted it to an SVG file, and then I like extruded the SVG to create like an STL, and then I like 3D printed it. So I think there's like a lot of like interesting ways we can use some of these like 2D image generators that we just haven't even thought of yet because it's so new. And it really is blowing up. It's crazy to think like how much I actually like in my undergrad, one of my concentrations was artificial intelligence. And back then it was like a big thing for CS people, but no one else really was talking about it. And so now to see every person I talk to being like, oh, have you tried this? Do you know about ChatGPT? It's like super cool. It's a little scary. I think how it's going to impact the art world is still like really up in the air. And I hope hopefully it can be more of like a tool to help artists rather than hinder them or I know the starving artist stereotype, like I don't want that to get worse, but we'll have to see. It's an exciting time to be experiencing it.
Yeah, I recently, only within the last year have I really had like exposure to AI, and it's become such like an integral part in my day-to-day life. I more so tend to use like the ChatGPT side in like my day-to-day workflow, but like you said, it's going to be interesting to see how it impacts artists over the next couple of years. And I almost feel like it's like a double-edged sword in the sense that I think it opens up a lot of possibilities for people who maybe don't have, like you were saying, maybe not the most inclined to like illustrations or things like that. But it's definitely going to be interesting to see how maybe like people who that was their background and what they really heavily focused on, how that affects those people. But certainly a really exciting time. Are you seeing any fashion brands right now that you know of who are using AI in any unique ways to bring out collections or anything like that right now?
Yeah, I believe it's Moncler that released an AI collection. I actually was a little underwhelmed a bit, or at least I think some of their image generations, they like didn't fix some of the details. It's a massive brand. I would have thought they would go in Photoshop, and I think AI does struggle with things like hands. Sometimes faces look a little wonky. Yeah. Sometimes there's like little details on clothing that like when you first look at an image, you don't notice. You're just like, wow, that's beautiful. But then if you like look, you're like, oh, the zipper like doesn't go far enough down for it to actually be functional. Or there's random buttons that like don't make sense, and just garments that you're like, how did this person even get into this like garment? And so I think that's going to be a really interesting thing the fashion industry is going to have to figure out is, okay, we're generating these things with AI, but like, how do we actually make this into a physical garment that someone can wear and is like actually going to serve the function they need it to? And you know, what if AI just stops? You want to make sure it has pockets if pockets are needed. The AI didn't generate that. That doesn't mean you shouldn't think about adding certain things to the design. Just because you see this beautiful image of a dress or a garment doesn't mean you can just make that a reality. Like you have to think about the design details and like whether it's actually going to have function. Like does it have the pockets that someone would normally want? Does it like actually fit over someone's head? Or like, is it a garment that someone can actually put on their body? Those are things AI doesn't think about, but we do. And so I think that's going to be like a really big thing fashion brands have to figure out is, okay, we generated these images, but how do we turn this into an actual physical garment? And so they're going to need probably fashion designers to do that. And then one of the other things they mentioned was there's a pretty cool thing called AI Fashion Week. And they did a massive open call for just like any people who play around with AI to submit a fashion collection. And I actually submitted one. And there's some really cool stuff. I would definitely recommend checking it out. And it's just, I think it's really easy to create one image that's like beautiful and well put together, but to be able to create a whole series of like 15 to 30 garments that not only look like really good and have like beautiful models and diverse models, it's also really hard to make everything cohesive because again, like the AI's design aesthetic, like it changes based on what words you prompt it with and what you're suggesting. And so being able to like actually create a cohesive collection is also like an interesting challenge. And they ended up with, I think, like 133 different collections. And so there's just some really great stuff to look at.
There's so many interesting things that you said in there. I'm really interested to go check out those collections. That sounds super exciting. Along the way you were talking about, specifically with like Midjourney, I know in the past I've heard people talk about the hands in particular, how it generates the images. They're like, oh my God, it's like the stuff of nightmares, what's happening with the hands. But what I had never thought about that you had touched on was its placement of zippers, or is it going to be feasible for a head to fit through this, or what's actually functional? It's something that, like, as somebody who doesn't actually make garments, I would have never thought of, but it completely makes sense. As you start to prompt Midjourney or different AI tools, is that something that you can work it with to make something that might be like a little more feasible in practicality? Or is that something that you feel like you have to, like, after bringing it out of Midjourney, maybe manually make those tweaks either like on paper or in Photoshop, things like that?
Yeah. So I think I have definitely tried, and they're like sometimes there are tricks. Like you can, the more in detail you can describe something in, oftentimes the better result you'll get in terms of what you're actually envisioning. But sometimes I also don't want to add those extra elements because I want to see what Midjourney thinks is creative based on what I put in. So I find there's often this balance between prompting a lot because you want something very specific versus prompting not too much because you really want to see like the ideas that Midjourney brings to the table. And again, this is also something that I think is sometimes a bit questionable or a bit like, it's hard to say, exactly where things are going to end up, because one thing I know I struggle with is that Midjourney does use like images from artists without their permission. And, obviously that's one thing to do for things that are out of trademark, very old pieces. We're taking like looks from the 40s. That's one thing. But then to take modern day clothing, and I think this is something that is already super bad in fashion, is like everybody gets ripped off. That's like exactly what fast fashion does. They just go buy the garments of like big fashion houses and then just try to figure out how to recreate them for really cheap. And I think Midjourney just does that on steroids with AI. That said, this is also what humans do, is like we take in all the art around us, and the art we create is often just like a conglomeration of all the art that we witness and adding our own twist on it. And I don't know much about how the trademarks and the rules around AI ownership is going to turn out in the future, but I'm definitely interested in watching that conversation because, like I said, fashion is already pretty rampant with copycats. And on one hand, there's not much you can do to combat that. I think Alexander McQueen said, I know people steal my designs all the time. That's why I just keep making awesome new stuff. So I guess that's one mentality to take. But I do think there are a lot of artists that get upset about it because it is rough when you see like something you've made stolen.
Yeah, I think that's another whole wormhole with AI and just like how the legalities of it are going to pay out, who owns the images that it's sourcing, what it's spitting out from. And I think I'm not sure exactly how old you are, but I was like the tail end of growing up without like cell phones and like internet being super popular. And like right as I was a teenager, that was becoming more popular. But I think I was into photography when I was younger, and seeing how Instagram changed that, obviously the creative process that you have when you're a lot more limited to being inspired by seeing other people's works on a daily basis and being able to scroll through and just have so much inspiration. I think it it a lot of times can change your process for how you make art and how you approach creativity. And I think one of the things that was always very difficult for me back then is it's hard to know if an idea that you have is ever an original idea, or if there even is such a thing as an original idea anymore. That's something that's always been like a really interesting concept to me, is how much of everybody's work, not just somebody who's newer or somebody who's at the top of their field, I guess like across the board, how much of people's creativity is inspired and how much is something that maybe didn't exist already or is completely innate for them. So I think that's, I don't know, it's something I could nerd out about all day.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think on the social media note too, it's like social media pushes us to be creative constantly. Like the artists that are like doing sketching every single day on their social media, I'm always so impressed by. And I do think there's a lot of good about like practicing creatively every day if you can, but it's also like when you feel like you have to do that for social media, I think it can really create like burnout and make you less excited to create, and trying to find that balance of you do want to share your art and you want to post, but also not feeling pressure to post like constantly. It's a hard balance.
Yeah, I definitely feel like you can get creatively burnt out pretty easily on the internet of feeling like you have to make something every day. However, I will say on that note, I know one of the things that you had talked about for a while was doing, I believe you called it a no zero day, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I've never heard somebody use that phrase before, but I really love that. Like I'm somebody, I struggle so much. I don't even want to use the word struggle. It's my own problem that I create for myself. But I will get so excited about a project and start it. And at some point along the way, I stop working on it. I never touched it again. And maybe for people who haven't seen that series that you did, can you just explain to people what that concept is?
Yeah, so I actually learned this from a friend who was writing a novel, and he basically had this idea called No Zero Days, which is where every day, I don't care how much I write, how little I write, I'm going to put a single word on paper at least towards my novel. And I think, at least for me, sometimes the hump is just getting started. And so it's, once I do a little bit, I actually get into the groove and I do a lot. And even if that's not true, at least I did something. So for myself, writing is a little bit easier to apply this rule to, because you can always say, at least I wrote one thing. I basically just told myself, like, at least I'll do one thing today. If all that thing is me writing a to-do list of things I need to do for this project for the future, like, I'm going to do something today towards this project or this goal. And it's something I've definitely tried to implement for specific projects, and even like on a bigger scale, though it is hard. There are days you mess up, but I feel like the biggest thing is just don't beat yourself up about it. Just get back on the horse the next day. I guess that's more like general life advice, but at least something I've learned as someone who definitely puts probably too much pressure on myself.
Yeah, no, honestly, I was laying up watching that last night. It was like honestly inspiring to me. It was like, that is something I need to absolutely implement in my life. And I think it can be a good way to approach maybe those projects that are a little daunting and it feels like maybe you're never going to get to the end. But like you were saying, just if it's as simple as writing down a to-do list, or I know in the one video, you're like, I'm just going to cut out one pattern. I think just those little steps they end up adding up. And like you said, I know for me, sometimes I'll sit down, I'm just going to sand one piece of my print, and then an hour later, I've sanded my whole project. So I definitely think it can be a good motivator there. But yeah, a really unique concept that I've never heard before.
Yeah. And I think one thing I love about TikTok as compared to like other social medias, especially like growing up, I think there was this idea like on Instagram, you like had to be perfect and everything you posted had to be this like super aesthetic, curated feed. And I think we should normalize more like posting failures and posting those days where like maybe you didn't get a lot done. Like maybe all you did was cut one piece of fabric. So those little wins like matter too. And no one like what on social media is not what is a reality. And so being able to share failures and I don't even know if I'd consider like that a failure, because I did do my day. Like it wasn't a 0 day, but maybe it was, I think reframing it, because it wasn't a failure. Like I did get something done, being able to like share that with people so that they also realize I don't have to do a ton today. I can do, what I can, and that'll be good enough.
Yeah, you said something interesting there that I guess I had never really thought of, but you're so right. Like Instagram, definitely, I feel like the idea there was like the highlight reel of your life and everything was perfect. Everything was so curated. But maybe that, I always say I love TikTok, and I feel like it's such a strangely nurturing place on the internet. Like people are very kind and helpful, and maybe that's what it is. I don't know. I feel like people are a little more accepting to show a realer version of themselves. But yeah, it definitely can be difficult when you're posting on the internet and seeing everyone else's highlight reel of their life and only the good pieces. So It definitely makes sense what you're saying. Now, when we talked about no zero days being possibly like a good way to approach bigger projects or more daunting projects, are there any projects in the back of your mind right now that you're maybe really excited about for the near future, or something that you just in the back of your head is something that's a really big project that you definitely want to take on at some point?
Yeah, so I've been experimenting with a couple different things. So I mentioned like my handbag class earlier. Every bag I've been making for that, I've been incorporating 3D printing. So one of the new things I really want to try is actually making like sewing a bag, but using like TPU printed. I've definitely experimented a bit with like 3D printing an entire bag, and I think that's really fun. But I want to try using TPU as like a pure textile where I print it in the shape of the pattern piece and then I like sew it together in like traditional construction methods. And I think that'll be really interesting. I think like it means you can do that like 3D element on a bag but also be able to line it with a nice material and make it in a more traditional way. And I think there are pros and cons. I don't know, like I think I'm explaining this and I'm like, oh, but people might think this is weird. Like, why wouldn't I just like 3D print the whole bag? But I think you can do both. And I think there are like interesting things about both. And I really exploring them both as options just gives me like more knowledge. And then I've been working on a like 3D printed corset that it's 3D printed on organza and then sewn together. And I actually created those designs using AI for the way that what I mentioned earlier, where I 3D printed using a like SVG converted to an STL. Actually, I went from a PNG in Midjourney to then an SVG, then to an STL. So lots of processing. Workflows can simplify at some point, but you make it work.
Yeah, since getting into 3D printing, file converters have strangely become like one of my best friends. But you talked about it, like the handbags that you're working on, and I know that there's a couple that you had posted videos of, and one of the things that you talked about is maybe people are like, why wouldn't you just 3D print the whole bag? But I think one of the things that I actually really loved about the pieces that you had made, you had it was a white structure that was 3D printed, but you had added flowers on there, and then I believe there was another one, I want to say it was blue, and I think that you had laced it together. And I always say this, I think that there's something really special, or maybe it's not special, but it adds a lot to a print when I think there's other material elements added. And I love that. I think it elevates the piece a lot. And I think it just makes it feel not just something that you could have pulled off the printer and anybody could have printed, but really like a custom thing that is unique to you and unique to your style. So I personally loved how you did those. I thought they turned out really cool.
Yeah, like some of my favorite garments, like one of my favorite designers, Alexander McQueen, he did so many like interesting work where it's like soft and hard and like looking at the dichotomies and use different materials. When you put like leather next to a tool, like that creates a completely different look than if you were only going to use like one of those materials. And I think 3D printing is like an extra like material you can use, and you don't just want to cut out all the other ones. Like I think that contrast really, I agree, like it adds more to the 3D print and really just enhances it. And maybe it takes a little bit more effort, but at the end of the day, like you have a better product.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think I've seen from Adidas, maybe, I think that they might have a shoe that I want to say it's partially 3D printed. Are you hearing of any other brands right now, like using 3D printing in their fashion, or is that not something that's like super mainstream?
Yeah, so Nike currently has a shoe that like the base is partially 3D printed, and I believe Adidas also has something similar. There are also shoes that are like fully 3D printed. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm forgetting this, but the brand that like Kanye was associated with.
Oh God. It's on the tip of my tongue.
I'm just going to look it up.
Is it Balenciaga or not them?
He worked really Yeezys is what I'm thinking of.
Yeezy, okay,
he worked really closely with Balenciaga. But yeah, so Kanye worked a lot with Yeezys, and Yeezy has a couple of, or at least one like purely 3D printed shoe. Okay. Obviously that's a much more luxury line, very expensive. A lot of what fashion brands use is more SLS printing, which is really great because you can get a lot better detail and cleaning up the print is a lot easier. I don't know about anyone else, but I don't like dealing with brims and supports if I can avoid it. I don't like sanding. I will do much more work than I should to avoid having to deal with those things. And so one of the nice things about SLS printing, which is a lot more industrial, I did a little bit of research and none of the SLS printers were within my price range, but a lot of them, the way it's like it works is more like a laser solidifies like a powder. And because of that, like all the other powder just like brushes away. You can wash it off once your 3D printed item is done. And so I think for shoes, which has a hollow inside, particularly like closed-toed shoes, you want something like that, or you want to use a filament that is dissolvable. That's actually something I eventually would like to do, is use like dissolvable filament for my supports and then actually 3D print shoes where I don't have to deal with supports. So that also might be a project on the horizon at some point, or summer's coming. So making like TPU sandals, those things are definitely on the list.
Whatever you end up coming out with, I'm excited to see what the next project is. With that said, I have learned so much talking to you today. There's a lot of cool things that I got from AI to fashion I had no idea about. So I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and talk to us. For people who don't follow you yet, can you tell everybody where on the internet they can check out your projects and what you're working on?
Yeah, you can find me at julia.leaf, and it's leaf with an E at the end, both on Instagram and TikTok. TikTok, I guess, doesn't have the dot. It's just Julialeafe, and then Instagram has the dot. I also have a portfolio site at julianne.dev, though it's not like as frequently updated.
Awesome. Thank you again so much for coming on today. It was a pleasure having you. And with that said, that is me.